Hello folks, and welcome back to my video gaming channel, RetroGamerDiaries, where we continue our story of the golden years of video games in the 80s. In my first episode, I covered the early 80s where video games were booming in the arcades. I, and I'm sure yourself, remember playing all of these classic arcade games. It was here where we discovered Space Invaders, Asteroids, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Star Wars, and so on. I absolutely loved everything about the arcades. It was a totally amazing experience and nothing could compare to it. And it was at this time that the video gaming revolution had a grip over the entire world. Episode 2 then covered the introduction of consoles into our homes for the first time, and in particular the success of the Fairchild Channel F, the Atari 2600 and the Intellivision.
The Defender sees lots of alien ships. The Defender sees lots of radar blips. Every blip is a ship.
Watch this, I got this, Captain.
On a body snatching trip. And it's up to Defender to save them. Defender, a great Atari game.
Have you played Defender? It's the newest of the smash hit home video games that just keep coming. Only from Atari.
You did better than me.
Have you played Atari today?
Star Wars. It's great in the arcade. Whoa! TIE fighters! Fireballs! Coming right at me! Watch the laser towers. Aim for the tops. Pick in the cannons. Use the force. It's coming too fast! It's way! It's way! My shields are gone! Alright! I'm going in!
Oh, some game, huh?
Some game!
In a galaxy of video games, there is only one. Star Wars, the arc.
You're a starship captain in an asteroid field. Blast them with your lasers or put up your shields. As a missile commander defending your city. If you're not quick enough, they'll show no pity. The invaders won't stop us from the skies they drop. Just keep coming.
3 out-of-this-world games from Atari, the #1 video computer system with more games than any other.
Everyone's gone Atari. The #1 video game.
Episode 3 then covered the invasion of home computers into our homes. These new and cheap home computers allowed millions of people to discover for themselves what a computer was all about. These were very exciting and magical times, and everything seemed great. However, amid competition from both new consoles and game developers, a number of poor decisions, particularly from Atari management, affected the company and the industry as a whole. The most public was an extreme investment into licensed games for the 2600, including Pac-Man and E.T. Atari's Pac-Man became the system's biggest selling game, but the conversion's poor quality eroded consumer confidence in the console.
To your Atari video computer system, and you're playing the hottest game since Space Invaders, Atari Pac-Man. Pac-Man fever. It's driving me crazy. Pac-Man fever. I'm going out of my
Hate to eat and run.
Pac-Man by Atari.
Then there was E.T., which was rushed to market for the holiday shopping season and was critically panned and a commercial failure. Both games and glut of third-party shovelware were factors in ending Atari's relevance in the console market. Atari's downfall reverberated through the entire industry, resulting in the video game crash of 1983. The video game crash of 1983, also known in Japan as the Atari shock, was a large-scale recession in the video game industry that occurred from 1983 to 1985, primarily in the United States. The crash was attributed to several factors, including market saturation in the number of video game consoles and available games, many of which were of poor quality, as well as waning interest in console games in favour of personal computers. Lasting about 2 years, the crash shook a then booming video game industry and led to the bankruptcy of several companies producing home computers and video game consoles. Analysts of the time expressed doubts about the long-term viability of video game consoles and software. Home video game revenues peaked at around $3.2 billion in 1983 and then fell to around $100 million by 1985. That was a drop of almost 97%. The crash abruptly ended what is retrospectively considered the second generation of console video gaming in North America. To a lesser extent, the arcade video game market also weakened as the golden age of arcade video games came to an end.
If you're wondering where your son or daughter is these days, there's a good chance you might find them here. America's latest midway attraction, the Video Arcade. By the way, kids, you might find mom and dad there too. But across the nation, the arcade business has seen somewhat of a slump. Time magazine reports last year's average weekly profit from an arcade video game dropped 25%. from $140 to $109. This year, it's projected to drop to $93.
It's been doing all right, but from last year, it's been down about 20%.
Why do you think that is?
Well, basically what my home office told me is those home videos.
Those home video games are doing very well. In many cases, they've just about exactly duplicated their arcade cousins, and this Tulsa store reports that their sales have been up at least 50% over the last year.
Video game sales have increased a lot in the last year because they're getting more like the arcade games. Exactly. A lot of them, mostly ColecoVision's games in the new Atari 5200, are almost carbon copies of the video games in the arcade.
Despite the popularity of home video games, it looks like there'll always be a niche for the cosmic fighter who wants to take his skills to the street and into the arcade.
I find that the arcade games have a little bit more action to them than the home video games. I think you get a little bit more isolation, and at home you have a little bit more distractions around you that take your mind off the game.
But an experienced home video game buff can keep his mind on the game for quite a while. So you put in quite a bit of time on it.
Oh yeah, when I'm bored, just go up and cut it on and start playing.
How many hours a week do you think you put in?
I guess at least about 20 or 30, I don't know.
During the next several months, the arcade industry hopes the introduction of the Laserdisc will boost profits. The innovation will give a three-dimensional effect with a picture similar to an animated cartoon. But the home video industry reports they are also working on that feature. So it remains to be seen who's going to zap who in the rapidly changing battle of arcade and home video games.
Okay, so let's have a look at these factors in a little bit more detail. The Atari Video Computer System, which was renamed the Atari 2600 in 1982, was not the first home system with swappable game cartridges, but by the end of the early 1980s, it was the most popular second-generation console by a wide margin. Launched in 1977, just ahead of the collapse of the market for the home Pong console clones, the Atari VCS experienced modest sales for its first few years. In 1980, Atari's licensed version of Space Invaders from Taito became the console's killer application. Sales of the VCS quadrupled, and the game was the first title to sell more than 1 million copies. Spurred by the success of the Atari VCS, other consoles were introduced, both from Atari and other companies such as Odyssey, Intellivision, ColecoVision, Atari 5200 and Vextrex.
Bring the arcade experience home. With arcade graphics, like Donkey Kong with multiple screens, just like the arcade game. Arcade controls, joystick, fire and jump buttons. Arcade games, like Turbo, Cosmic Avenger, Venture, with 15 screens. And Zaxxon, games that let you have the arcade experience. Now you can bring the arcade experience home. Because your vision is our vision.
Notably, Coleco sold an add-on allowing Atari VCS games to be played on its system, as well as bundling the console with a licensed home version of Nintendo's arcade hit Donkey Kong. In 1982, the ColecoVision held roughly 17% of the hardware market, compared to the Atari's VCS at 58%. This was the first real threat to Atari's dominance of the home console market.
I'll try almost anything. So when Mattel Electronics asked me to compare their Intellivision games with Atari, I gave it a try. I compared Atari baseball with Intellivision and found Intellivision played much more like real baseball. Then I compared Atari football with Intellivision. Again, Intellivision played more like the real game. In my opinion, if you try them both, there's only one conclusion you can come to. Intellivision from Mattel Electronics.
Each new console had its own library of games produced exclusively by the console maker, while the Atari's VCS also had a large selection of titles produced by third-party developers. In 1982, Analysts marked trends of saturation, mentioning the amount of new software coming in would only allow for a few big hits, that retailers had devoted too much floor space to systems, and that price drops for home computers could result in an industry shake-up. In addition, the rapid growth of the video game industry led to an increased demand, which the manufacturers over-projected. In 1983, an analyst for Goldman Sachs stated the demand for video games was up 100% from the previous, but the manufacturing output had increased by 175%, creating a significant surplus. Atari CEO Raymond Kassar recognized in 1982 that the industry's saturation point was imminent. However, Kassar expected this to occur when about half of the American households had a video game console. The crash occurred when about 15 million machines had been sold, which soundly undershot Kassar's estimate. Dearie me. Prior to 1979, there were no third-party developers, with console manufacturers like Atari publishing all the games for their respective platforms. This changed with the formation of Activision in 1979. Activision was founded by 4 Atari programmers who left the company because it felt that Atari's developers should receive the same recognition and accolades as actors, directors and musicians working for other subsidiaries of Warner Communications. That was Atari's parent company at the time. Already being quite familiar with the Atari VCS, the 4 programmers developed their own games and cartridge manufacturing processes. Atari quickly sued to block sales of Activision's products, but failed to secure a restraining order and ultimately settled the case in 1982. While the settlement stipulated that Activision must pay royalties to Atari, the case ultimately legitimised the viability of third-party game developers. Activision's games were as popular as Atari's, with Pitfall released in 1982, selling over 4 million units.
Swing up the swamp crocodile. The gold. Did I mention the targets?
Pitfall, a jungle adventure game designed by David Crane from Activision.
Just last night, I was lost in the jungle with Pitfall Harry, surrounded by giant scorpions and man-eating crocodiles.
Well, Harry and I just grabbed the van, swung through the trees, and over the tar pits and found the jungle treasure. It was really neat.
If you haven't met Pitfall Harry, you're missing the year's most incredible video game adventure. Pitfall for the Atari 2600 and in television.
Since I met Pitfall Harry, no other man will do.
Pitfall, designed by David Crane for Activision.
Do you have ice hockey by Activision?
Think you're ready for it? One of the roughest video games around for your Atari game system? Ready to battle for the puck? Well, to inflict fierce body checking, furious stick checking, ruthless tripping. You really think you're ready for all that? I'm ready! Fine. Here's your charge.
Ice hockey by Activision!
Hello. Activision asked me to demonstrate their exciting new video game, Skiing. Pop the cartridge into your Atari video computer system and fly through downhill courses over moguls. A small boo-boo. Many slopes to challenge you. Try the slalom race. Shush through tight gates. Sacre bleu! And voila! It's Skiing by Activision. So real you must have it. No kidding. I think I hurt myself.
Prior to 1982, Activision was one of only a handful of third parties publishing games for the Atari VCS. By 1982, Activision's success emboldened numerous other competitors to penetrate the market. However, Activision's founder David Crane observed that several of these companies were supported by venture capitalists attempting to emulate the success of Activision. Without the experience and skill of Activision's team, these inexperienced competitors mostly created games of poor quality. Crane notably described these as the worst games you can imagine. While Activision's success could be attributed to the team's existing familiarity with Atari VCS, other publishers had no such advantage. They largely relied on industrial espionage, such as poaching each other's employees or reverse engineering each other's products, in their attempts to gain market share. In fact, even Atari themselves engaged in such practices, hiring several programmers from Mattel's Intellivision development studio, prompting a lawsuit that included charges of industrial espionage. Very cutthroat industry at this particular time. The rapid growth of the third-party game industry was easily illustrated by the number of vendors present at the semi-annual Consumer Electronics Show. According to Crane, the number of third-party developers jumped from 3 to 30 between 2 consecutive events. At the summer 1982 Consumer Electronics Show, there were 17 companies including MCA and Fox Video Games announcing a combined 19 new Atari games. By 1983, an estimated 100 companies were attempting to leverage the Consumer Electronics Show into a foothold in the market. Atari documented 158 different vendors that had developed for the Atari VCS. In June 1982, the Atari games on the market numbered just 100. By December, that number grew to over 400. Experts predicted a glut in 1983, with only 10% of games producing 75% of sales. Byte stated in December that in 1982, few games broke new ground in either design or format. If the public really likes an idea, it is milk for all it's worth, and numerous clones of a different colour soon crowd the shelves. That is until the public stops buying or something better comes along. Companies who believe that microcomputer games are the hula hoop of the 1980s only want to play a quick profit. By January 1983, companies had licensed everything that moves, walks, crawls, or tunnels beneath the earth. Activision, Atari and Mattel all had experienced programmers, but many of the new companies rushing to join the market did not have the expertise or the talent to create quality games. Titles such as Kaboom! Like Lost Luggage, Rock Band Tie-In, Journey Escape and plate spinning game Dishaster were examples of games made in the hopes of taking advantage of the video game boom, but later proved unsuccessful with retailers and potential customers.
So you think you're fast enough to beat the bomber? I don't think so.
Kaboom! By Activision. Plug this cartridge into your Atari video game system and get ready to handle high explosives. Don't sneeze. Don't even blink, because the faster you get, the faster he gets.
And if you miss...
Kaboom! By Activision.
Data Age presents the world's first rock video game, Journey Escape. The concert's over. Now you must help each member of Journey escape through mobs of love-crazed groupies, shifty-eyed promoters,
I can get you the forest.
and sneaky photographers.
I said no pitch. Move.
Find your roadies and manager.
You've got 10 minutes.
And run for the escape vehicle and live to rock another day.
Don't stop.
Journey Escape for the Atari 2600 from Data Age.
The flood of new games were released into a limited competitive space. According to Activision's Jim Levy, they had projected that the total cartridge market in 1982 would be around 60 million, anticipating Activision would be able to secure between 12 and 15% of that market for their production numbers. However, with at least 50 different companies in the new market space, and each having produced between 1 and 2 million cartridges, along with Atari's own estimated 60 million cartridges in 1982, there was over 200% production of the actual demand for cartridges in 1982, which contributed to the stockpiling of unsold inventory during the crash. Wow, all a bit of a disaster really, isn't it? Prior to 1982, Atari was considered the dominant company in the home video game industry, but as described, new players in the hardware market and the loss of publishing control caused the company to slip from its dominant position. During 1982, Atari took several missteps in trying to regain its dominance, but caused the market and consumers to lose confidence in the company and, in turn, the video game industry as a whole. One factor was around certain games Atari chose to publish, as by this point, with the company owned by Warner Communication, it was more focused on business opportunities rather than innovation. Many of its executives were MBAs and looked for any business opportunity that would give them an edge over other third-party game publishers. Coleco's deal with Nintendo for Donkey Kong was a major threat to Atari. Atari had past success with its own licenses of arcade hits ported to the Atari VCS, but also began to look at other lucrative license opportunities that they could separate themselves from other companies.
Test you like never before. Discover the Atari that opened your eyes to the world's most popular home video games like Space Invaders, Missile Command, and Warlords. Discover the Atari that brought you a home computer truly designed for the home. Sophisticated for advanced needs, yet simple enough for your child to use. Compose music, play advanced games, manage your finances, all at the touch of a button. Discover Atari. And discover how far you can go.
Two games in particular, released in 1982, often cited respectively as major contributors to the crash, contributed to weakening Atari's consumer confidence: Pac-Man and E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial. The Atari VCS port of the arcade hit Pac-Man was released in March 1982 and was critically panned, with its graphics cited as particularly poor. While some vendors cancelled orders, most of the large retailers continued to sell the game, and Atari sold 7 million units in 1982. Still, the quality issues hurt the Atari brand and led some consumers to ask for refunds.
Now from Atari, a great new video game, Pac-Man. To stay alive, Pac-Man must eat power pills, vitamins, and growth.
I'm putting supper on now.
But beware, the ghosts bite back.
You've got 2 minutes.
Pac-Man's appetite is insatiable. To keep ahead of the game depends on your skill at feeding him.
Supper is served.
Pac-Man, the all-consuming video game, only from Atari.
E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial was developed by Howard Scott Warshaw in only 6 weeks under rush orders at Atari's direction to meet the sales for the 1982 Christmas season, after Atari had secured the rights to the film for about $20 to $25 million. E.T. was a top-selling video game in the late 1982 and early 1983, according to Billboard, selling 2.6 million copies by 1983, but also was met with lackluster reviews across the industry, with primitive graphics and dull gameplay. In 1983, returns outstripped sales by 660,000 units.
From Atari, made especially for systems from Atari, the video game that lets you help eat.
The combined impact of the underperforming sales and poor quality of Pac-Man and E.T. reflected on Atari, as it caused consumers to become wary of the company's future products, leading to a slowdown in sales entering 1983. Atari attempted to improve future arcade and licensed game ports to draw back consumers, such as the Miss Pac-Man port, which was more positively received by critics. However, they were unable to capture similar sales numbers as prior to 1982. Quite sad, really. The Commodore 64 survived the crash and became one of the best-selling computers of all time.
Pack is more value than ever. You get an education in computers with the new Commodore 64, all these extras, plus 4 very realistic games, like Le Mans Formula 1 racing, one-day cricket match, and the armchair official America's Cup computer game. The new Commodore 64 Family Pack, $499, keeping you ahead in the game of life.
Because computers generally had more memory and faster processors than a console, they permitted more sophisticated games. Home computers could also be used for tasks such as word processing and home accounting. Games were easier to distribute since they could be sold on floppy disks or cassette tapes instead of ROM cartridges. This opened the field to a cottage industry of third-party software developers. Writable storage media allowed players to save games in progress, a very useful feature for increasingly complex games, which was not available on the consoles of that era.
All the peripherals you're ever likely to need: monitors, plotters, printers, disk drives, and a vast range of software, which means you'll get so much more enjoyment out of your home computer. The Commodore 64. Remember the enormous memory, but don't forget the peripherals and software.
This is a Commodore home computer system. With it, you can learn music, take care of your household accounts, file your lists, type your letters, get into telecommunications, and entertain your family. But it all starts with the Commodore 64 or VIC-20. And now is the right time to start because the price of all Commodore software is now up to 50% less. Commodore computers, in more homes than any other home computer.
Woke up, opened up the door to play games with my 64. But there was Mom with her mailing list, Susie catching up on the math she'd missed, and playing music a little rock. The dad was charting his favorite stock. Commodore is great to play and learn, especially when I finally get my turn.
Commodore, bringing computers down to earth.
Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you. In a world of fun and fantasy, and ever-changing views, and computer terminology, Commodore is news. Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you. Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you.
In January 1982, the Commodore 64 personal computer was introduced with a 64K built-in memory for under $600. So to stay even with Commodore in memory and price, IBM will have to slash its price, quadruple its memory. Apple will also be faced with a sizable chore, and so will Atari. As Shearson American Express put it, the Commodore 64 could be the microcomputer industry's outstanding new product introduction since the birth of the industry.
In 1982, a price war that began between Commodore and Texas Instruments led to home computers becoming as inexpensive as video game consoles, after Commodore cut the retail price of the C64 to $300 in June 1983. Some stores began selling it as little as $199. People were starting to ask themselves, why should I buy a video game system when I can buy a computer that will play games and do so much more? Commodore explicitly targeted video game players. Spokesman William Shatner asked in VIC-20 commercials, why buy just a video game from Atari or Intellivision, stating that unlike games, it has a real computer keyboard, yet plays great games too.
Commodore computers in more homes than any other home computer.
Why buy just a video game from Atari or Intellivision? Invest in the wonder computer of the 1980s for under $300. The Commodore VIC-20. Unlike games, it has a real computer keyboard. With the Commodore VIC-20, the whole family can learn computing at home. Plays great games, too. Under $300, the wonder computer of the 1980s, the Commodore VIC-20.
Coming soon, Commodore brings you Gorf, the Wonder arcade game, and Omega Race in home versions. Commodore. A day in the life of a Commodore 64.
Commodore's ownership of chip fabricator MOS technology allowed manufacture of integrated circuits in-house. So the VIC-20 and C64 sold for much lower prices than competed home computers. Very smart.
The Commodore 64. Once you get it, you'll wonder how you got along without it.
However, by 1983, the computer slump began. Suddenly, everyone was saying that the home computer was a fad, just another hula hoop. The arcade game crash of 1984 took down the majority of the computer game magazines with it. And by the winter of 1984, only a few computer game magazines remained. And by the summer of 1985, Computer Gaming World was the only 4-colour computer game magazine left. The release of so many new games in 1982 flooded the market. Most stores had insufficient space to carry new games and consoles. As stores tried to return the surplus games to the new publishers, the publishers had neither new products nor cash to issue refunds to the retailers. Many publishers, including games by Apollo and US Games, quickly folded. Unable to return the unsold games to defunct publishers, stores marked down the titles and placed them in discount bins and sale tables. Recently released games, which initially sold for $35, were in bins for $5. The presence of third-party sales drew the market share that the console manufacturers had. Atari's share of the cartridge game market fell from 75% in 1981 to less than 40% in 1982, which negatively affected their finances. The bargain sales of poor quality titles further drew sales away from the more successful third-party companies like Activision, due to poorly informed consumers being drawn by price to purchase the bargain titles rather than the quality. By June 1983, the market for the more expensive games had shrunk dramatically and was replaced by a new market of rush-to-market, low-budget games. Crane said that those awful games flooded the market at huge discounts and ruined the video game business. A massive industry shakeout resulted. Magic withdrew its IPO the day before its stock was to go public. The company later collapsed. Magnavox abandoned the video game business entirely. Magic withdrew its IPO the day before its stock was to go public. The company later collapsed. Activision had to downsize across 1984 and 1985 due to loss of revenue, and to stay competitive and maintain financial security, began development of games for the personal computer. Within a few years, Activision no longer produced cartridge-based games and focused solely on personal computer games. Atari was one of those companies most affected by the crash. As a company, its revenues dropped massively due to dramatic lower sales and cost of returned stock. By 1983, Atari had lost $356 million and was forced to lay off 3,000 of its 10,000 worker staff. Unsold Pac-Man, E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial and other 1982 and 1983 games and consoles started to fill their warehouses. And here's the interesting bit. In September 1983, Atari discreetly buried much of this excess stock in a landfill in New Mexico, though Atari did not comment about this activity at this particular time. Misinformation related to sales of Pac-Man and E.T. led to an urban legend of the Atari video game burial that millions of unsold cartridges were buried there. Gaming historians received permission to dig up the landfill as part of a documentary in 2014, during which former Atari executive James Heller, who had overseen the original bury, clarified that only 728,000 cartridges had been buried in 1982, backed by estimates made during the evacuation, and disproving the scale of the urban legend. Atari's burial remains an iconic representation of the 1983 video game crash. And by the end of 1983, Atari had over 536 million in losses, leading to Warner Communication to sell Atari's consumer products division in July 1984 to Jack Tramiel, who had recently departed Commodore International. Tramiel's new company took the name Atari Corporation and directed their efforts into developing their new personal computer line, the Atari ST, over the console business. Lack of confidence in the video game sector caused many retailers to stop selling video game consoles or reduce their stock significantly, reserving floor or shelf space for other products. Retailers established to exclusively sell video games folded, which impacted sales of personal computer games. The crash also affected video game arcades, which had several years of a golden age since the introduction of Space Invaders in 1978, but was waning by 1983 due to the expansion of home consoles, the lack of novel games, and undue attention to teenagers around the video game arcades. While the number of arcades in the United States had doubled to 10,000 from 1980 to 1982, the crash led to a closure of around 1,500 arcades, and revenues of those that remained open had fallen by 40%. The full effects of the industry crash were not felt until 1985. Despite Atari's claim of 1 million in worldwide sales of its 2,600 game system that year, recovery was slow. The sales of home video games had dropped from $3.2 billion in 1982 to 100 million in 1985. Analysts doubted the long-term viability of the video game industry, and according to Electronic Arts' Trip Hawkins, it had been very difficult to convince retailers to carry video games due to the stigma carried by the fall of Atari until 1985. All seemed lost during this crash. However, there was a comeback kid, somebody who changed everything, and its name was Nintendo.